I'm going to talk about the class customer engagement and the work that we've been doing over the summer of 2014. Just to remind ourselves of what the objectives of the work are, there's basically two broad types of trial going on related to reduction of peak demand and frequency response and voltage support. And all of this, the purpose of the project, of the class project, is to understand the voltage and demand relationship. And part of this is to understand what this means for the customer. So this is where the customer engagement comes in. What we did in the spring of 2014 was carry out a large baseline survey, and then we started the process of going back to those same people that we interviewed while the trials are going on. And you can see here that there's three waves: summer, autumn and winter. We've completed the summer wave, and this is what I'll be reporting on today. We have the data from the autumn wave, but there'll be a period of analysing that before we can present it, and as we speak the winter wave is underway. The outcomes of this is evaluation of class. So again, part of that effort will be to take the learnings from this customer engagement work. We've got to deliver those results and the learnings from them, and then ultimately for this information to enable class to be transferable to UK DNOs. So what we did, the class trial surveys began in the summer. So as I mentioned, we had this baseline data that's before the class work, and that's quite important because it means that anything we learn during the trials, we have that baseline to compare against. And of the 800 customers that were recruited at the baseline stage, for this wave, we've interviewed nearly 200 of participants from that first baseline study, of which the majority, as you might expect, are domestic interviews, but we also have 42 INC customers. So for the purpose of what we're doing, this is a statistically robust and representative sample, but of course this is only one wave out of three waves that we're ultimately going to be working through. So it's very much just kind of first stage reporting on what we've learnt, and we're looking for this data to build up over time, which will obviously increase the robustness of the information. So the challenge, basically the purpose of the work is in a sense to not exactly prove a negative, but certainly support this hypothesis that class will not be discernible to customers. They won't see, observe or notice an impact on their supply when these techniques are introduced. So basically we're thinking of the customer, the quality of the supply that they experience, and how this might relate to the innovative techniques that are being conducted as part of the class project. So, as I mentioned, we're just reporting today on the summer trial surveys, which began in May and continued to the end of the summer. As I mentioned, we've got broadly two types of trial going on, the Stage 2 Type 2 and also the Stage 1 Auto-Enable. And what we did was split the interviews between those people who would actually be exposed to the trials and those who would form a control group. So basically we'd be sure that they wouldn't be affected at all by class. So we have that basic ability not only to compare results with the baseline, but also compare at the same time between those who experience the trials and those that don't. The baseline questionnaire was a full 25 minutes with lots of detail. These follow-up surveys are only 5 minutes. They're carried out on the phone, and they're with individuals, as I said, recruited at that first stage. And the key question, of course, is have they noticed any discernible differences in the quality of their supply? A follow-up question is that if for any chance they do believe they've noticed something, then do they actually care? Does it impact on their satisfaction with the service? And in each of these interviews, the customer was rewarded with £25. This is quite a bit higher than a typical market research survey, but the essential thing here was to encourage enough numbers of people from the original survey to take part in the subsequent trials. So first of all, we took thinking in terms of test groups. So these are customers who weren't aware of whether they actually were in the trial area or not in the trial area, or there during a trial event. And these are particularly obviously those ones that would be subject to the trial. And then we had a comparable group who would then be the control group. So these are clearly not affected by the class trial. To try and sort of spread the risk of any sort of noise coming in and giving us a kind of false positive, what we did was make sure that half of the people in the control group would be interviewed half a day or a week before the tests and another half afterwards. So these are people we know are not actually in the trial area, but if for any reason, unforeseen reason, that there's some sort of connection with what's going on in the class trials, we could be sure that they'd be spread out over time. So we're really making them as genuine a control group as we could manage. And then also, one other thing we investigated was we really wanted to be sure that we sort of maximise the chance of picking up anybody noticing a change in the quality. So in addition to splitting it up in this way of test and control, we also notified some people that these trials were going on. It didn't necessarily mean it was actually happening at a particular time or it was actually happening to them at all. But half the test group and half the control group were then exposed actually to communications that said these trials are going on. So we felt that was a way of maximising sensitivity to the trials. So first of all, I've just got a few slides with the executive summary, the key learnings from the work so far, and then I'll dive into a little bit more detail, partly to explain what's behind some of our findings, but also to point ahead the kind of things we're going to need to look further into as the data builds up. So, first of all, what have customers noticed? Just one thing in parallel to the actual surveys, of course, E&W receives contacts from customers, maybe for a whole variety of reasons. And what we wanted to do was just to check whether there had been any complaints received over that summer period that could be thought to be related to the class trials. So this would be from people actually in the area at the time the trials were happening, and whether what they were complaining about could conceivably relate to an effect from class. So the first result there is that there were no complaints that we could identify in that way. So that's not a strong finding in itself, but clearly it's another bit of data to indicate that nothing seems to have come up so far related to the trials. And then when we think about the survey, the key thing here is that when we talk to the customers in the baseline interview, about 1 in 5, 20%, actually reported noticing a change in their service. So if you like, that's a kind of baseline level that's nothing to do with class, that's just all the things that can possibly be going on in the way people experience their service quality. Quite a big component of that tends to be lighting. The kind of thing you might notice is flickering lights and so forth. But what it means is that when we then did the summer wave, we also get an almost identical figure, about 1 in 5. So it suggests that, it's measured with the baseline and there's no difference, which effectively means that there's no evidence that class has shifted that awareness of changes in quality. And then when we really dig down into the data, we identify a very, very small portion, 2%, who said they noticed a change, who could conceivably be a change that's as a result of class. So these are people who've A, noticed a change, B, it's around the time that the trials are taking place, and C, it's in a form that actually might make sense in terms of indicating the effect of the class trials. So having said that, a very, very small number possibly related to class. We talked also about notifying people. So again, the idea behind this was partly to, if you like, maximise the chance that people might be aware. So if you kind of sensitise them slightly, they might be looking out for certain things. But when we actually look at the results, so we can compare and contrast those in the tests and in the control groups between those that were notified and not notified, we see no significant differences. Now, this is one thing we'll be looking out more for as the further waves come in, the data builds up. But certainly on the data we have so far, there's no evidence that whether they're sensitised or not sensitised, or in the test or in the control group, that they actually notice any difference in power quality. And that's just to emphasise that really with the numbers so far, there's no statistical basis for any differences. Now, looking at the impact on customers, we started to dig a bit deeper and say, well, are there certain customer types who might be more sensitive? And one of the things we looked at was distance from the substation, because it's conceivable that because of the changes in voltage, then there might be more or less chance of noticing differences. But again, so far with the data we have, we don't identify any significant differences versus the overall figures. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later on. And then finally, if we look at these 1 in 5 people, for whatever reason, saying there's a service change, The next question is say, well, if they notice that, do they actually become less satisfied? Do they actually identify a problem? And again, what we're seeing is that certainly where we think that there could conceivably be an effective class, even if that was the case, the satisfaction is not negatively affected at all. All of those people give a high level of satisfaction. Okay, so to go into a little bit more detail about people noticing a difference, as I mentioned, no complaints. And then this is the a little bit more detail on the baseline versus the monitoring wave. So we see our baseline, almost 21% people saying they've noticed some sort of difference. And then when we look at the current wave, it's nearer 22%, but that's not significantly different. That's a mix both of domestic and I&C. And the strict definition is, have they noticed a difference in their appliances or lighting in the previous 7 days? And as we'll go on to see, lighting is one of the biggest things if people mention anything at all. Now this next slide breaks down that 22%. So we might then say, well, our first tip is to say 22% people notice something. How do they then split? Are there more of them in the test group or more than the control group? Are there more of them in the notified and the not notified? So what this shows is that in actual fact, and there isn't a statistical significant difference with these sort of sample sizes, but actually, if anything, the number of people noticing are less likely to be in the test group than they are in the control group. So whatever's going on is nothing certainly to do with class. There might even be a hint directionally that if people are notified, they're slightly more likely to say, well, I've noticed something. But again, those are not significant figures, and we'll have to see how they develop with the subsequent waves. We've broken it down a little bit further. You can see because domestic are the largest parts of the sample, then they're kind of driving the results. But you can see the pattern repeated. They're probably a little bit stronger indication amongst the control group, but again, no real pattern. And then for the I&C customers, a hint that they're slightly more sensitive in the notified, but again, none of these are statistically significant. It's really the purpose of showing it is more that we'll keep looking at this as the data builds up. So we can conclude from that whether they're notified or whether it's control and tests, we don't see as yet any significant differences. The other thing we dived into was actually the nature of the tests. So we have the stage 1 auto-enable, stage 2 type 2. And here we've got reasonable samples in both cases. And here we do actually start to see some difference in the proportion of people saying that they've noticed something. So if you remember, the average is about 20%. Then we do see quite a bit higher proportion for the stage 1 and quite a bit lower for the stage 2. But there's a big caveat with this figure, because the unplanned is one particular event set up, and all of our interviews for there are all gathered around that one event. So this is more a kind of a signal to say we're going to carry on looking at this with the new waves. It's by no means a finding at this stage, but it's an indication that we're already picking up some differences, but we really have to think about how comparable these two groups are before we jump to any sort of conclusion. But at the moment, there's an indication there's more likelihood, but we know that's to do. This is quite a range of different trials, and this is really just one event that's being reported here. We can also see a bit of contrast between domestic and business. So a higher number of domestic customers are likely to mention they've noticed something. This is right across the board. This is not just whether they're in test or control. Quite a bit lower in I&C. And as I mentioned, for the domestic, a lot of it is about noticing things like flickering lights. Okay. Another thing we looked at, which I mentioned, is about distance from the substation. So if we look at here, this is sort of close to the substation through to furthest away. Do we see a difference in the incidence of people saying that they think the service has changed? And what we see, first of all, that even though this range is sort of 18 to 24%, with these kind of sample sizes, this is still not a significant difference. This is more likely to be random than it is an actual finding. However, directionally, if we carry on doing the waves and we still see this pattern, then it might hint at those that are furthest away with the lowest voltage and those that are near with the highest. Maybe there's a possibility that they're likely to notice something. That still doesn't mean it's to do with the class. They just may be more prone, but it may be something that we explore more in depth as the survey data builds up. So you can see on the current evidence, there's no statistical significance here, but we'll keep looking at this as the sample builds up. We also got a lot of detail on the appliances people had in their houses. This was collected off the baseline study, and then we investigated as to whether they'd noticed any change in the quality of service with any of the appliances in their household. So again, as the waves carry on, we'll be able to build this information up in a bit more detail. But the kind of thing we're looking for is, do they notice change in the performance of appliances? Do they notice things like the lights changing? And the thing that comes out, if people mention anything at all, it's really primarily related to what they've noticed about the lights. So they either describe it as a dimming of lights, flickering of lights, or even lights going more brightly. So what we've done here now is, because of the sample sizes, the contrast is really between what we're picking up in summer against the baseline. So again, this is not about test or control. This is about everybody we're looking at now against the baseline. And what we see generally is that there's, again, very little difference between the baseline, which is before the trials are occurring, and the current wave when the trials are occurring. You can see there's no difference really at all in the dimming of lights. There's actually less noting of lights in the monitoring, and no difference in terms of brightening of lights. Now, of course, what we're probably seeing here is more primarily a seasonal effect. So, people are not going to have the lights more often on earlier in the year than they are in the height of summer. And again, when we get to autumn and winter, we may well see different figures again. But none of this really indicates something fundamentally different about what people are experiencing, other than possibly a seasonal effect, as opposed to anything to do with class. Okay, so if we see any of these things, and we've just gone into detail really as to where and when potentially could people say that they notice a change in quality more, what evidence, if at all, is this to do with the actual class trials? So going into a bit more detail here, this is the figure that we've shown before. We said that 22% notice change in their appliances or lighting in the current wave. When we actually delve down and identify who they are, 3% of those, which is something like about a sixth of that group, actually weren't at home during the test. So whatever they're talking about, it certainly can't be to do with the test. So, but we're down to this group now who were at home when the class test was being carried out. So first of all, we're looking at could they actually conceivably have been exposed to anything. Similar chart to before, this is taking that 19% that we identified and breaking it down by those in the control and those in the test, those that are notified and those not notified. And again, we see this pattern that actually, if anything, those in the test area are less likely to see a service change. And it's not significantly different, but if it's in any direction, it's going away from the idea that class could actually be affecting their service quality or them noticing it. And then there's a slight, smallest hint that being notified may actually make them slightly more sensitive too, but if it is, it's extremely small and it's not significant in statistical terms. So again, that's our conclusion at the moment, but we'll carry on looking at that as the waves build up. So if we then take where we were before, we've got these 19%. So we saw already from that previous chart that actually a bulk of them were in the control area. So again, they couldn't conceivably have been exposed to any of the class activity going on. 8% were in the test periods and the test areas. But if we go right down here, the change that they're actually reporting in their appliance or in the lighting, they're not actually talking about a time when the trial was actually taking place. So they might have been in the area, they might have been classified as a test group, but actually when they're talking in detail about this event, they can't possibly be in the time when the actual trial was being carried out. So in the end, we get down to the 3 people who have talked about a change in appliance or change in the lights, and it could be tracked down to a time when the actual class trial was taking place. So, again, that in itself doesn't mean that's a class, but it means that it's worth finding out a bit more about what they did notice and what the characteristics are. So in this chart, we've actually now down to 3 people. The first person talked about the performance of their LCD TV. The other person talked about their tumble dryer, but also mentioned some flickering of lights. And this third person, it was about energy saving, broadband, and dimming of ceiling lights. So again, some of those things, again, probably aren't conceivably related to class, but things like the lights could be. But even if it turned out these people were impacted by class, the second interesting thing is that in all their cases, they're 10 out of 10 satisfied. So even if this is a class event that's impacting on them, it's clearly not affecting their perception of quality. Yep. So the other thing is, I think it's this third person that actually, when you look into the detail, it's unlikely that even what they were talking about was actually likely to be related to the class trial. So the numbers get smaller and smaller as we go along. But I think the key thing is that we're going to continue looking in depth at this as the data builds up, just to see give kind of maximum chance of spotting something if it is there. Okay. So ultimately, did the trials have an effect on customers' perception of quality? So this is sort of stepping back and saying, well, whether or not people are actually exposed to the trials, the fact that they're going on, do we see some sort of shift in satisfaction? So the baseline is that, as we know, satisfaction with service is generally very high. So on a scale of 1 to 10, you think you're doing pretty well if you're getting scores of 8, 9 and 10. And we can see that the percentage of those is really the majority of people are giving those top 3 scores. However, when we go to the monitoring phase, so this is now while class is actually taking place, we can see that the satisfaction gets even stronger. So again, there's possibly a bit of a seasonal effect or other factors going on, but it's certainly in the direction away from the idea that class could be leading to a service reduction. Just going into more detail, if we look at the baseline, these top scores of 8, 9 and 10 account for 89% of people. And when we look at people who actually said they noticed a change, that drops to 74%, which is still actually quite a high level of satisfaction in most sectors. However, when we look at the monitoring, we actually see, as you can see on the bar chart, it's almost everybody is in that top 8, 9 or 10 score. And when we look at those people who report a change, there's really no difference in that level of satisfaction. So whatever may or may not be going in, it's certainly not having any sort of impact on overall satisfaction. So next steps, as I mentioned, what we're reporting on today is just the summer surveys. So we've done the baseline, we've done the summer surveys. The field work has actually taken place for autumn, so it's a case of analysing that and reporting it, and the winter surveys are currently taking place. We've got highlighted in red. And in fact, I neglected to mention, there is plans to have a fourth one later on in March to April. So all of this data building up should give us the best possible opportunity to detect an effect if there really is one. Thank you.